So last time we finished here talking about exchange of the capillaries. So when you look at the capillary, it has two ends. One is the arterial end that comes from the arteriole, and the other one is where it joins to the venules, is called the venous end. Okay, so different things happen at the different ends, and there's blood coming from the arterioles is at high blood pressure. Okay, by the time it reaches the venous end, the blood pressure is lower compared to the arterial end. Okay, before I continue this point here, it belongs in the next slide. This doesn't happen in the arterial end, it happens in the venous end. Okay, this point has been put here by mistake. Okay, so take note of that, please.
So, how many types of capillaries? Just two?
Well, there's different type of capillaries, but we're just going to talk about generally, right? So the main structure of the capillary is that it is only an endothelium. Okay, that's what because it's important for the exchange. It doesn't have the other layers. We talked about that last time. Okay. So at the venous end, at the arterial end, the blood pressure is high, while at the venous end, the blood pressure is low. Remember we talked about the solutes in the plasma, the proteins like albumin and the other globulins. They're responsible for the tonicity of blood. Okay, remember the osmoregulation. So blood coming here will have less solutes. Okay, so the osmotic pressure here is lower. What causes exchange at the arterial end is actually the blood pressure. Okay, the blood pressure causes fluid to leak out of the capillaries at the arterial end. Okay, so fluids leak. With it, it carries oxygen, nutrients, and other materials. Okay, so blood pressure causes the fluid to leak.
So what's the OD?
Sorry, osmotic pressure. All right. The other one is blood pressure. Okay. So the osmotic pressure is lower here. As the fluid moves out, it carries with it, because of the blood pressure, okay, nutrients, oxygen, and raw materials into the, you remember we called it interstitial fluid surrounding the cells.
Yeah.
So I think it's not mentioned here. Here it is. Into the interstitial fluid. Okay. So these materials, oxygen and nutrients, move with it. Okay. Except for the plasma proteins. Okay. Like albumin, the globulins, and red blood cells. They don't leave. Okay. So red blood cells, globulins, albumins, they do not leave the capillaries. They stay within the capillaries. Okay. So by the time the blood reaches here, it's lost fluid. What's happening to the concentration of the solutes? Who can tell me? By the time the blood reaches here, the fluid has left most of it, but the solutes are still remaining, like these proteins. So what's going to happen to the blood when it reaches there?
Maybe shrink.
What?
Well, the blood is not going to shrink. The blood, it's going to become more hypertonic. Yeah, because there's more solutes, less fluid. So what happens here is, okay, that now, because of the osmotic pressure is high here now. Okay? You understand why the osmotic pressure is higher?
Yeah.
The fluid once again returns to the capillaries, okay, at the venous end. When it returns, it carries with it carbon dioxide and waste. So this point here, what I mentioned is should be here, okay? All right. So at the arterial end, blood pressure causes fluid to move out. At the venous end, the osmotic pressure is responsible for returning the fluids back with waste and carbon dioxide. Okay? So, not all of the fluid is returned back, okay? Some of it is still remains in the interstitial fluid, and for this we have the lymphatic system, okay? The lymphatic capillaries, they surround. So there's the blood capillaries. Then we have the lymphatic vessels, okay? They absorb the excess fluid and return it back into the cardiovascular system. In the same way it returns the lipids, okay? So it returns the fluid back to the cardiovascular system. Excess fluid. If we didn't have the lymphatic system, our body will swell, because we won't be able to return the excess fluid back, okay? So the lymphatic system is important in carrying that excess fluid from the interstitial, from the surrounding cells, okay? This interstitial fluid back to the cardiovascular system. Is that clear? Okay. We've got a question here. So which of the following plays the most significant role in regulating the distribution of blood into the tissues?
Capillaries.
It's the capillaries, huh? Because we have capillaries everywhere in our body.
Yeah.
Okay, this one question, it says all of the following features of capillaries that promote exchange between blood and interstitial fluid, except which one, okay? Which of the following doesn't promote? Yes.
4.
Number 4. Capillaries have tiny valves. Capillaries do not have valves, okay? We got that?
Yes.
Which we're going to talk about next is the veins. They do have valves, alright? Okay, so let's move on to this activity, new lesson. As we mentioned before, that the lymphatic vessels, they carry the excess fluid from the surrounding tissues that's left over from capillary exchange. And the lymphatic vessels, they don't have blood with them. They have another substance called lymph, okay? It's basically similar to plasma, but it doesn't have the proteins of the plasma, okay? Similar consistency to plasma, except it doesn't have the plasma proteins. So this, because the fluid in the surrounding tissues is similar to plasma, except it doesn't have the plasma proteins because they don't leave the capillaries. Remember in the exchange I said capillaries, when the fluid leaves, the plasma is removed from the capillaries, except for the plasma proteins and red blood cells. So when it's absorbed back by the lymphatic vessels, essentially it's absorbing the plasma except for the plasma proteins, okay? So this blind-ended lymphatic vessels, blind-ended means they don't have a circuit, okay? See, they start here at the blind end and then they join the main vessel. Unlike capillaries, they have a circuit, they join back to the, so it circulates around the heart, all the blood vessels. The lymphatic vessels, they don't do that, okay? Because they're not connected to a pump like the heart. So they also have valves like the veins, okay? The one-way valves, and they use the muscles to move the fluid rather than the heart. Okay, so they're not in a circuit; they're blind-ended blood vessels, and they return the fluid back to the vein near the heart. Okay, we have a major thoracic duct, it's called, from the lymphatic vessel. It joins one of the major veins. We call that the subclavian vein, and it drains the lymph back into the blood. Okay, which is lymph is basically plasma, as I said, without the proteins. So it drains back into the blood. So we already know that the lymphatic vessels, they pick up lipids. Where do they do that? Where do they pick up lipids? Digestive system, Remember the lacteals? So they pick up lipids, okay? So because they're too large to enter the capillaries. They also act as a cleaner for our surrounding tissues. They can pick up microorganisms, okay? And destroy them, because in the lymph we find a lot of white blood cells, different type of white blood cells that help to filter the lymph, and in filtering they destroy microorganisms, okay? And this is the feature that is important in the immune system, okay? And the immune defenses, okay? Because the lymphatic vessel is an important part of the immune system, but it functions, in picking up excess fluid, bringing it to the the cardiovascular system. From the digestive system, it picks up lipids, returns them into the blood. So besides its immune function, it has function in removing excess fluid from the tissues and transporting lipids into the cardiovascular system, okay? Is that clear? Okay, so let's have a look at the veins. And you remember from your laboratory, when you look at the histology slides, you see that the veins have a much thinner wall, okay? That's because they have a thinner smooth muscle and connective tissue. The smooth muscle and connective tissue is thinner. The reason is because when the blood reaches the veins, the pressure has already dropped, so it's not necessary to have a thicker wall. It's the same layers as the artery, but thinner, okay? So it's much thinner. And so the thin part is actually the smooth muscle and the connective tissue. It still has the one layer of endothelium, the simple squamous, okay? Simple squamous epithelium. Yes, and when you look at them, they have one-way valves, and the diameter is larger than arteries, okay? You remember this under the microscope, you saw the veins have a much larger diameter. And this is the reason they can act as reservoirs for blood. Your cardiovascular system can store blood in the veins because they have a capacity to stretch like a balloon, and store blood. So it can act as a storage for your blood, the veins. That's why they have these larger diameters, okay? And they have the one-way valves. These one-way valves like this, you see, the blood flows in one direction, it doesn't return back unless there's a problem with the valve, which we'll discuss in the next slide in some diseases, okay? So it can act as a blood reservoir. You know what that means? A storage, okay? A reservoir is a storage, okay? So as a storage. Any questions on that? Okay, so the valves here, normally, when you have downward pressure on the valve, it keeps it closed, okay? If there is a problem with the valve, in the case of this condition called varicose veins, I'm sure you've seen this in some older people, in their hands or mostly in here, the veins are bulging. This is because if you stand for too long, the blood pools there and causes the veins to stretch and expand, okay? And this also caused by leaky valves as well, okay? This condition called varicose veins.
How can we avoid this?
Well, don't stand for too long in one place. You can move, okay? Because when you move the muscles, we have, when I talk about in the next slide, we have these different methods of moving the blood in our body. And the muscles are very important. And the valves, they play an important role. Okay, so I'll explain to you how you can avoid this. It's like this, by these mechanisms. So moving, don't stay, because if you, standing for a long time in an upright position, the gravity is pulling the blood in your legs, okay? And you're not moving. The movement provides an upwards force to return the blood back to your heart. If it's not returning, it's pulling into your legs. So don't stand for too long, and that's what's causing it. So the blood collects in the legs and the feet because of gravity, and you don't move. And you see here, this is what it is actually in the legs. This varicose veins, these bulging of the veins, and it's caused by, these leaky valves. So how can you avoid that? So we got two mechanisms of, actually three different mechanisms of returning blood back to the heart.
What is them moving?
So we got the skeletal pump, muscle pump, okay? This involves the skeletal muscle around our body, okay? The skeletal muscle around our body and in combination with the valves in the veins, okay? So if you have a look at here, say, this is your leg, okay? There's the muscle and the vein is between the muscles. It has a valve like that, okay? When the muscles contract, it pushes the blood from this compartment into this one, okay?
Yeah.
When the muscles relax, when the gravity forcing the blood down, closes the valve, okay?
Because it
Doesn't go back into the next compartment.
Yeah.
And then you have another valve here, okay? And so on. It pushes the blood up and up and up until it returns back to the abdominal cavity, okay? There's a simple experiment you can do with your arm to check for the valves, okay? So, if you see the veins in your arm, these are the veins, what you can do is hold below, put pressure on it to block the vein, okay? And then you push the blood upwards like that. You see the blood, there's no blood there now. Can you see that? There's blood here, but there's no blood there. As soon as I let it go, it returns back into the, because there's a valve here preventing blood coming back down.
I don't have veins.
Well, if you do, block one of the veins, okay, and push the blood upwards. You will see it drains, okay? There's no blood. Then when you there's blood in the top compartment, but not in the lower. So if you let your hand go, the blood comes from the lower back to the. It's showing that there is a valve in between these, okay? So you can test for valves. That's how they do it in the nurses, because if they want to go into a vein, they can check so they don't damage the valve when they put the needle in there. They can check for valves. Okay. Now, so you understand how, so, from one compartment to the next one, the blood moves. As the muscles contract, it pushes it from here to here, from there to there. When it relaxes, the downward pressure closes the valve. Okay? Then you move again, then the same thing happens again. It keeps on happening until the blood reaches here in your abdominal cavity, okay? So this is the skeletal muscle pump, we refer to this, okay? We understand the mechanism of that?
Yes.
Then we have the respiratory pump, which involves your respiratory system, okay? The breathing. When we inhale, when we breathe in, what happens is that the pressure in the abdominal cavity increases, okay? The pressure in the thoracic cavity, okay, where the chest is, decreases, okay, when we breathe in. This change in pressure causes the blood from the abdominal cavity to move into the thoracic cavity, okay? So every time you're breathing in and out, the blood is moving from the abdominal cavity into the thoracic cavity where the heart is, okay? So this is called the respiratory pump, okay? Because it moves the blood from the abdomen, okay, the abdominal cavity, into the chest where the heart is. So the process, is abdominal pressure increases, squeezes the blood veins, just like we did before with the muscles, pushes the blood up, and when we exhale, the pressure drops back in our abdominal cavity. What's preventing the blood from coming back down? Valves, huh? The valves. So the same mechanism. Pressure causing the blood to come here. When the abdominal cavity relaxes, the valves prevent the blood from coming back down. So the valves are very important. So you have two mechanisms. We have the skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump. Okay? Any questions on that? Okay, so let's move to the heart now. And this is, one of the remarkable organs in our body. Continuously on without the need to be, stop or rest. It doesn't need to stop or rest for 100 years, Allahu Akbar. A remarkable organ. So you find this cone shape right in behind the sternum, this place, and it's tilted to the left slightly, okay? It's the size of your fist, the heart. So it's a muscular organ. What type of muscle does the heart have? Cardiac muscle, okay? It's the only place where you find cardiac muscle, okay? It's different to the other muscles. And the other remarkable thing is that it has its own nerve signal. It generates its own nerve signal to run. So you can take the heart out and it will still be beating outside of your body because it doesn't receive, the brain doesn't keep the heart pumping. That's why people who have brain damage, the heart still pumps. Because if you get brain damage, your heart stops, you die. So it's a mechanism to keep you alive even though you got some brain damage. So the heart itself generates its own electrical signals. But the brain and hormones and environmental signals can affect the rate. It can increase or decrease it, okay? So it generates its own signals, but other factors can affect the rate, okay? If you're scared of something, you perceive that danger. So then the adrenal glands release a hormone called adrenaline. This causes your heart to beat faster. Adrenaline gets you ready to fight or flight, or the fight or flight hormone. So it is controlled by the brain, okay? The heart rate, not the actual. It doesn't actually produce the electrical signals that keep the heart pumping, the beat, the electrical signals, but it can control the rate of it, the brain.
Just the right.
Yes. Alright, so if you have a look at the anatomy of the heart, we find that the heart is inside a little sac, a bag. This keeps it protected and anchored in place to the surrounding tissues. It keeps it in place and protected. We call this the pericardium, okay? It's a fibrous connective tissue, okay? Fibrous connective tissue, dense and loose connective tissue together, okay? So it helps to protect the heart, it anchors it, it means it keeps it in place, and also it prevents the heart from overfilling. It's like a limit for the heart. Once the heart has blood that reaches the size of the pericardium, it can no longer fill, okay? So it prevents it from overfilling. The other thing is it produces a type of lubricating fluid, and we talked about other organs producing lubricating fluids, and the lubricating fluid is still the same. It's called serous fluid, okay? This acts to protect the heart from damage because it's constantly beating, okay? So between the pericardium and the heart, there is a lubricating fluid that keeps the heart lubricated, reduces friction, okay? You know lubricants, they reduce friction. By reducing friction, you lower the damage to the heart, okay? So the pericardium is very important in anchoring, in protecting the heart, in stopping it from overfilling, and preventing friction that by producing this lubricant, so the heart doesn't get damaged, okay? So when we then move on to the rest of the look at the cross section of the heart, we find three other layers, okay? We call it the epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. So the epicardium, the outermost layer, we find right here, okay? This layer here is the epicardium. This is the pericardium, okay? So the epicardium is a thin layer of epithelial and connective tissue, okay? And that's partly responsible for producing this serous fluid as well, okay? The myocardium, this is the thickest layer. We find that this is the muscular layer, alright? The muscle is the cardiac muscle. So this is what is involved in the actual movement of the blood, the contractions, the cardiac muscle. So the innermost layer right here, we find a thin layer also of endothelium. This endothelium is continuous with the blood vessels. Okay, so we find this in the heart, covering it, and in the blood vessels. So the inner layer, the endothelium, is resting on on a thin layer of connective tissue. Remember, endothelium is always attached to connective tissue. Okay. So we find the outer layer, the epicardium. It's a epithelial connective tissue. Then we find this thick layer of cardiac muscle. That's what's responsible for maintaining the heartbeat, okay? The contractions. So it's cardiac muscle. Then the inner layer of endothelium, which is resting on a connective tissue. That's the three layers of the heart itself. Like this. Let's have a look at inside the heart, see what we find. So when we look at inside the heart, we find that it has 4 chambers, okay? 2 upper chambers, we call them the atria, okay? Or sometimes singular atrium, okay? So these have a thinner wall, okay? Because their function is just to push the blood into the ventricles, okay? So the blood doesn't need to go too far from the atria. That's why they have a thinner muscular wall. Then we have the thick muscular. We call them the ventricles, the bottom chambers. So when we look at the anatomy of it, we find that the left ventricle has a much thicker wall than the right ventricle, because the left ventricle pumps blood to the rest of the body, while the right ventricle only pumps it to the lungs, okay? So it doesn't have to go too far. This left ventricle, the blood has to go all the way to the bottom and top, everywhere, okay? And when you measure the blood pressure, you know this with the sphygmomanometer, you remember? Did you do the lab?
Yes.
This blood pressure is actually the blood pressure inside the left ventricle, okay? When you measure it, because it's in the same height. That's what we measure it. So, when we look at it, we find that the right ventricle pumps to the lungs, okay? The left ventricle is the most muscular, it pumps to the entire body. That's why it has the thicker muscle. And the two sides are separated by this muscular wall. It's called the septum. So this septum separates deoxygenated blood from oxygenated blood. Okay, this structure is known as the septum. Any questions on that?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
System transition, the blood for
So, it separates the right side from the left side. So the right chambers from the left chambers, because the right side carries deoxygenated blood. You don't want to mix with the left with the oxygen. So this muscular wall here separates it. It's called the septum, the two sides. Does that answer your question?
septum
Yes.
transition the blood for the lung. Right?
So basically, the septum separates the two sides. It's a separation. It's a wall between the two. Yeah, it separates the two sides because you don't want oxygenated and deoxygenated blood to mix. It separates the chambers. Okay. So I have a video here. Let's watch this on the previous lesson on blood, and then we'll do Kahoot, okay?
Okay.
How much for what?
For the blood.
For blood? No.
What is blood? Blood is actually a mixture of cells suspended in a slightly yellowish liquid called plasma. Plasma is made